Hi, everybody. This is going to be part one of two. This part is all of the semantics. It's pedantic. It's going to be the boring part, boring but necessary. And that is looking at type and mistype, some of my nomers and misnomers, things that I've believed in the past that I've kind of modified my beliefs, but mainly a discussion of language that we don't necessarily, or nuances that we don't necessarily pull apart. And that is, when we look at personality theory, there's at least three layers to that stack. I'll use three for simplicity's sake. That is, there's the base of your neurology, how we are hardwired, where we pay attention based on what's going on between these two ears. There's the layer of identity, self-identity, what's happened through nurture over time, whether through choice or not. I think many things not through choice, how we've evolved our own selves. And then there's the layer of behaviors on top of that. So cognitive personality theory, that is MBTI, I would posit is a combination of neurology and identity, meaning it's the hardwiring plus the kind of middleware that's been built on top of the hardwiring. That's your operating system, that collectively how things work together. When we look at what an MBTI type is through tests, you're taking the behaviors and then trying to dig down through the behaviors to understand the identity, and then take a gander at the neurology to say, what does this mean about who you are? And then what does the who you are mean about how you're wired and where you are paying attention? Whereas, let's say, Enneagram is maybe more of a combination of behavior and identity. It doesn't care so much about how are you hardwired, it's how do you behave in these situations and how does that give insight about who you are. So this is something that we just don't talk about, these nuances, and that's where things get kind of messed up. This is where, say, talking with famous people and Dario Nardi have different approaches to try and say, let's get to the hardwiring to figure out where does your brain kind of turn on and do all of its funky stuff, depending on which functions are the things that capture your attention and hold it. Whether you do that through cognitive tests or you do that through sticking electrodes and taking readings of the brain, different approaches, similar effort and outcome to say, what does this tell us about your hardwiring and attentional matters? Identity is more frequently used by a lot of other typologists to sort of go through and say, well, how do you behave at a party? Okay, this tells us something about who you are. What are your plans in 5 years? Okay, that tells us something about who you are. And based on how you answer those things, that tells us about you as a person that has developed. And that's your personality type. And that's where you get that dissonance and potentially a series of mistypings, because one is trying to figure out who do you believe you are as a person, or how are you seen in the world, versus kind of the low layer of how do you pay attention to the world and where are your attentional priorities. This sounds like a lot of semantic stuff, but it makes a really big difference, because you look at, for instance, Nardi or Kiersey, and they believe that the IN types each represent about 1% of the population, based on the way that they examine the field. Go to Truity, and they'll say that INFPs, for instance, are about 6% of the population. Go to Personality Max or to 16 Personalities, they say that INFPs are about 15 to 20% of the population. So 1% to 20%, there's a big dissonance there in definition, and we don't have kind of a common language to say, okay, what is it about the way you're describing this personality type that's different from the way that I'm describing this personality type, so that we can sort out why you've got this many ESTJs and I've got that many ESTJs, because clearly one of us is counting things differently than the other. So I've softened my own stance in that when neurology and identity and behavior all line up, it's easy to tell type, usually. I'm not great at doing it, but other people are. But when neurology and identity don't line up, if someone sees in their core personality DNA that they are an INFJ, but they have the attentional manners of an ISTP, what are they then? Well, in one set of studies, they would be an ISTP because that's their attentional manners, that's their neurology. In the other set, they would be an INFJ because they walk like an INFJ and talk like an INFJ. They don't do it as effectively as one that has the stack that's ordered correctly, that all lines up, but they do have that INFJ identity. Therefore, other personality theory or theorists would classify that person as an INFJ because they're doing all of the INFJ things, they believe all of the INFJ beliefs, and so forth. Where things do get messed up is when identity and behavior don't line up. And that's when somebody says like, for instance, I'm an INFJ, yet they get angry all the time, fly off the handle, get into fights with people, and gleefully do so, and engage in other behaviors that don't seem to line up with the sort of identity that one would expect an INFJ to have. And this is where kind of more people would agree to say, okay, that's where it doesn't quite work. Just to do a quick segue, if you look at it from a role-playing game perspective, if you're familiar with tabletop role-playing games or even computer role-playing games, the neurology is almost like your attributes. They're set, they don't really change much. You've got this much strength, that much agility, that much charisma, and that's kind of what you've got and what you're going to work with. Your identity is more like your class. So you've chosen to take on the career path or the adventure path of being a monk or of being a paladin or of being a mage. And so it's possible that your attributes are very high in strength and intelligence, but low in wisdom, but you still, as your identity, have chosen the adventure path of a cleric. Kind of a bad analogy, but it gives you an idea that that's kind of who you are versus how what your underlying wiring looks like. And then behavior might be more like alignment, that you say, okay, this is how I choose to move about in the world, and a cleric is expected to behave in particular ways that would be clericy, as opposed to a mage that one would expect would do more research and do more majory sorts of things, and so forth. Anyway, this is part one. The second part that I'll get into is just what does all of this mean for what the role of an INFP is in society, based on, again, it's a lot of conjecture on my part, but based on the wiring and on the identity that INFPs have. So I think that this is a path that's open to anyone that looks at the term INFP and identifies with it, whether or not it's across the stack or not. There are certain things that an INFP can do that play an important role in society. And so it's not just about self-identity of like, what do I think about who I am? And I can read all of these great things about what I am. Isn't that lovely? But to say, what does this mean for my responsibility in the greater scheme of things? What is my role? What is my purpose here in life? And that we'll get into in part two. Thanks for listening. I hope this is helpful in some way. Again, on my side, I do believe that people can be INFPs by identity and therefore be INFPs, even if they do not lead with FI and NE in a Jungian fashion. But more important than my personal beliefs and differences in belief on who is and who is not an INFP is that we have this language to say neurology, identity, behavior. These are different kind of layers of the cake of where and how we choose, or where and how we choose to pay attention or pay attention to the world, how we identify with the things that we engage with in the world, and then how we choose to act or not act in the world. Thanks again, and bye for now.